$18 trillion. That isn't a deficit, not a debt, not the GDP of a continent. It's the amount of phantom value that evaporated from Japan in roughly a decade, the largest destruction of paper wealth any single nation had ever produced by that point in recorded history. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the years just after World War II. Japan had been bombed to rubble. The country had no natural resources, very little arable land, and a population that had just watched its empire collapse in fire. What it did have was an extraordinary capacity for collective discipline, and a government willing to build an industrial policy from the ground up. By the 1960s, Japan was exporting televisions. By the 1970s, it was exporting cars that ran better than the ones Detroit was making. By the 1980s, it was exporting the future itself. Semiconductors, robotics, consumer electronics. Companies like Sony, Toyota, and Mitsubishi were not just profitable. They were transforming how human beings lived. Japan's economy became the second largest on Earth, and the world decided that Japan had discovered a secret the rest of us had missed. That belief is where the trouble starts, when a society becomes convinced that its economy has found a permanently higher gear. Asset prices begin to do something strange. They stop reflecting the earnings that an asset produces and start reflecting the earnings that people imagine it will produce forever. The gap between those two numbers is called a bubble, and in Japan, through the 1980s, that gap grew until it became a chasm. The mechanism was deceptively simple. Japanese banks, flush with deposits from a high-saving population, began lending aggressively against real estate. Land in Japan is genuinely scarce. The country is mostly mountains, and the flat habitable portions are crowded, so land had always been expensive. But in the 1980s, the government kept interest rates low to encourage growth, and when credit is cheap and land is believed to be a one-way bet, banks lend more, buyers bid more, prices rise. The collateral behind the loans rises with them, which allows banks to lend even more. This is a self-reinforcing loop that financial historians call a credit asset spiral, and it's one of the most dangerous things a modern economy can produce because it feels, from the inside, exactly like prosperity. By the late 1980s, Japanese land prices had become surreal. Office space in Tokyo's Ginza district was selling for roughly $1 million per square meter. Not per building, not per floor, per square meter. The Imperial Palace grounds in central Tokyo, a park roughly the size of a mid-sized American suburb, were estimated at the time to be worth more than the entire state of California. Every house, every farm, every strip mall, every warehouse in California, together worth less than one royal garden in the middle of a city most Americans had never visited. The Nikkei 225 stock index, Japan's equivalent of the Dow Jones, climbed from roughly 10,000 in 1984 to 38,957 on the final trading day of December 1989. In 5 years, Japanese stocks had nearly quadrupled. The combined market capitalization of Japanese equities reached a point where Japan, with roughly half the GDP of the United States, had a stock market worth more than America's. At the peak, analysts were publishing serious research papers arguing that the Nikkei would reach 80,000 by the mid-1990s. Then the Bank of Japan blinked, concerned about inflation and the increasingly obvious disconnect between asset prices and economic reality. The central bank began raising interest rates in 1989. From 2.5% in May of that year, the overnight rate climbed to 6% by August 1990. This sounds technical. The consequence wasn't. When interest rates rise, borrowing costs rise. When borrowing costs rise, the buyers who had been stretching beyond their means to purchase land and stocks at ever higher prices stop buying. When buyers stop buying, prices stop rising. When prices stop rising, the entire logic of the credit asset spiral reverses. Banks that had lent against collateral worth 100 suddenly find that collateral worth 60, then 40, then 20. Borrowers who had assumed they could always sell for more than they paid discover they can't sell at all. The loop that felt like prosperity runs backward, and it runs backward hard. The Nikkei peaked on December 29, 1989. It fell 39% in 1990 alone. By the summer of 1992, it had lost more than half its peak value. Japanese real estate, which had been even more inflated than the stock market, fell in some regions by 80 or 90% over the following decade. Land that had secured hundreds of millions in bank loans was auctioned for fractions of the original collateral. The banks, which in a healthy system are the arteries through which credit flows to businesses and families, found themselves carrying mountains of loans that would never be repaid. Rather than recognize those losses, many institutions, with the quiet encouragement of regulators who feared the panic that honest accounting would produce, carried the bad debts on their books at fictitious values. These became known as zombie banks, institutions technically alive but economically dead, unable to lend meaningfully because their true balance sheets were insolvent. The human cost unfolded slowly, which in some ways made it more corrosive than a sharp crash. Japan didn't have a single catastrophic moment, a Black Monday or a Lehman weekend. It had 2 decades of attrition. The unemployment rate rose. A generation of young workers, the ones who graduated in the 1990s and 2000s, entered a labor market that had no room for them in the permanent employment system that had defined Japanese corporate life. They became known as the lost generation, and many of them never recovered the career trajectories that their parents had taken for granted. Suicide rates climbed. Rural communities that had borrowed against rising land values to fund local development found themselves with debt that outlasted the local economy itself. Between 1989 and 2003, the Nikkei fell from 38,957 to roughly 7,800, an 80% decline that took longer to produce than the entire post-war economic miracle that preceded it. The $18 trillion figure is both real and abstract. It represents the distance between what Japanese assets were priced at during the peak and what a reasonable fundamental valuation would have suggested. It is the weight of collective belief, leveraged with borrowed money, that evaporated when the belief changed. No fraud was committed in the way that fraud requires a single, identifiable criminal. The banks followed rules that had been written for a different world. The regulators had watched the boom and decided not to intervene. The corporations had borrowed because borrowing was cheap and everyone else was doing it. The ordinary citizens who bought apartments at peak prices had listened to the consensus of every expert in their society and concluded that land could only go up. The lesson that Japanese economists and central bankers took from the episode, and that their counterparts in America and Europe arguably failed to learn before 2008, is that a credit asset spiral is most dangerous precisely when it looks most like success. The years when a bubble is most inflated are also the years when the most respectable institutions are publishing the most confident predictions of further gains. By the time consensus acknowledges the problem, the spiral has already reversed, and the only question remaining is how long the unwinding will take. Money, it turns out, doesn't disappear when a bubble bursts. It reveals that it was never entirely there. The dollar 18 trillion was always partly a story that asset holders were telling each other, a story denominated in yen and backed by land and shares, but a story nonetheless. When enough people stopped believing it, the story ended, and 2 decades of real economic life, real jobs, real savings, real retirements were spent paying the interest on a fiction.